Hey guys, how's it going? Today's going to be another basketball video, and today I want to talk about a few topics on my mind. And the topics I'm going to go through is I'm going to talk about four things. First of all, I want to talk about the most underrated basketball player of all time, in my opinion. Number two, I want to talk a little bit more about Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. Number three, I want to talk about some topics discussed on the NBA on TNT program, like the NBA's 50 greatest players. And fourth topic I want to talk about is the greatest players of each decade, the all-decade teams. All right. So first topic, the most underrated player of all time. So I did a video a few months back about the top 10 underrated players of all time, in my opinion, and they included several ABA players. They included several players from the 50s who I thought were really underrated. And in general, I think players from the 50s and players from the 70s, especially ABA players, tend to be the most underrated players or forgotten the most in these conversations about great basketball players. And I think the reason for that is that players from the 50s, they just don't get remembered very well because there's not much footage of them, and the league was just too young back then. It was too long ago, and then people discredit their achievements because they played in a really early era, so people forget about that. And I just want to mention some players that got snubbed by ESPN that played in the 50s and 60s that were part of the NBA's 50th anniversary team, which means that they were part of the NBA's 50 greatest players celebration back in 1997. And these three players are Dave Bing, Hal Greer, and Bill Sharman, and all three of them are shooting guards. And yeah, I have no idea why they got snubbed by ESPN. They're not. They're part of the NBA's 50th anniversary team, but for some reason they're not in ESPN's top 100 list, and I'm not sure why. Because, I mean, aren't these guys top 100 players? Like, they're all Hall of Famers, right? So I have no idea why they got snubbed. But yeah, I just want to give a shout out to these guys, so just that people remember that these guys are there, because they are kind of underrated. I think Dave Bing, Hal Greer, Bill Sharman, sorry you guys, you got forgotten by ESPN and by a lot of people, but there I just gave a shout out to those guys. And players from the 70s get kind of forgotten because the talent was really split between the NBA and the ABA during that time, so it was a really chaotic time and just not much footage back then. Yeah, so especially with ABA players, because there wasn't much coverage for ABA games back then, so they weren't broadcast much, and there's not much footage of them. That's why they tend to be forgotten, and it doesn't help that ABA players don't really have their stats or achievements remembered by the NBA. They kind of just get forgotten. So that's why I think those players get forgotten the most. So shout out to these ABA players: Connie Hawkins, Spencer Haywood, Dan Issel, George McGinnis, Roger Brown, and Mel Daniels. I think they get forgotten pretty easily. In fact, they were the best ABA players, and Artis Gilmore, by the way, but they didn't even get ranked, except for Artis Gilmore. The rest didn't even get ranked on ESPN at all. Like, I did an ESPN commentary on their top 100 NBA players of all time, right? ABA players got completely forgotten. Even players who didn't play their entire career in the ABA but played some of their career in the NBA, like Connie Hawkins, like Spencer Haywood, like Dan Issel, George McGinnis, they didn't get remembered. They weren't in the top 100 at all, even though I do think they're top 100 players. And Roger Brown and Mel Daniels didn't even get to play in the NBA. So yeah, that's too bad for them. But I think I found the most underrated player of all time, and it is a player from the 50s, and his name is Neil Johnston. Neil Johnston was the center for the Philadelphia Warriors. He actually won a title back in '56 with Paul Arizin, I believe. So Paul Arizin did make it into the top 100 list, even though he's really underrated there. He also made it into my top 10 most underrated players video, as well as my top 50 players of all time video. But Neil Johnston, man, I forgot about this guy. He's so underrated, I even forgot about him in my top 10 most underrated players video. That's how underrated he is. But when you check out his resume, he was a one-time champion, 6-time All-Star, 5-time All-NBA, and 4 of them were first-team NBA. 3-time scoring champion, one of the only a few players to be 3-time scoring champion, and his stats are 19, 11, and 2.5 a game. And he actually has a decent free throw percentage for a big man, which is 78%, which is quite good for a center. And he's so underrated, his number isn't even retired by the Warriors. He played for the Philadelphia Warriors, which today is the Golden State Warriors, and for some reason, Golden State Warriors, they have not retired Paul Arizin or Neil Johnston's jerseys, even though they're the ones who led them to a championship back in the 50s, so that's really weird. Easily the third best center of the 50s after Russell and Mikan, and should be top 50 all time if you look at his career and stats. So that is my pick for the most underrated player of all time, Neil Johnston. Okay, and yeah, and this guy also was the league, he led the league in win shares, I think, during that entire decade. So basically, he basically carried the rest of his team. So yeah, that's another thing I want to point out. By advanced metrics, he's also one of the greatest players. So really, this guy, I'm sorry, Neil Johnston, you tend to be left out of a lot of people's lists, including ESPN. And yeah, that's the first topic I want to talk about. Second topic is about Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. So Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain are considered rightly by many players to be the greatest of all time. But when I talk about this online, a lot of people discredit him because they just think that, oh, Russell and Chamberlain, they're just so much bigger, taller, stronger than other people, and then people discredit their achievements, especially for Bill Russell. Bill Russell winning 11 rings, they discredit Bill Russell's achievements by saying that, oh, the league was weaker back then, there's only 8 teams, there's less competition, etc. And for Wilt Chamberlain, because he was so dominant, 50 points a game, 100-point game, he gets really discredited because he's like, oh, that guy was, the rest of the players he was facing against was really like all white people, much shorter than him, etc. Well, I just want to make this clear, okay? I found a list of all the players that were 6'11" and taller during Russell and Wilt's time, so during the 60s. And here's what I found. Yep, so you can check that out. That's what I found. 6'11" or taller players during Russell or Wilt's time. There's actually a whole bunch of them. I didn't even list under 6'11". There's a whole bunch of players that are 6'5", 6'6" to 6'9". Didn't even list them, but that's actually quite a bit of players. So yeah, just because of the era, it doesn't mean that players magically got taller during the modern NBA times. People were always tall. Like George Mikan was like 6'10", right? And he played in the 50s. So and Neil Johnston, by the way, was like 6'10". So yeah, that's what I want to make. And the league not dominated by white players. Okay, you have a case to say that in the 1950s. The NBA was predominantly white players, but not so in the 1960s because the league was more integrated by then. And there were several good black players I could think of in the 1960s, right? Oscar Robertson being one of them, Willis Reed being one of them. There's a whole bunch of good black players. Hal Greer, So you can't really say that there weren't many black players in the 60s. About not much competition. The thing is, yeah, there were 8 teams or 9 teams in the 60s, but the thing is, the teams were stacked in the 1960s due to less teams collecting more talent overall. So think about the talent pool, right? If the talent pool is still relatively good, but the teams are less, that means there's going to be more talent in each team. This is kind of the same thing what happened in the 80s when you have a lot of talent, but you don't have as much teams. This is also why the teams are kind of diluted right now because there's so many teams, not as much talent to fill those teams with. So back in the 60s, you had just stacked teams, Hall of Famer teams. Bill Russell obviously had a good team. He had Bob Cousy, John Havlicek, Tom Heinsohn, Sam Jones, Seth Sanders, Bailey Howell, a whole bunch of great Hall of Famers on that team, Casey Jones. But there were also great players on other teams as well. You had Rick Barry, Nate Thurmond for the Warriors. Wilt also played with the Warriors for a brief time. You had Lenny Wilkens, Bob Pettit on the Hawks. You had Oscar Robertson, Jerry Lucas on the Royals. You had Willis Reed, Walt Frazier on the Knicks. And then you obviously have Elgin Baylor and Jerry West on the Lakers. And Wilt Chamberlain, Billy Cunningham, Hal Greer on the 76ers. So there were a lot of great players back then. Chet Walker was another player of 76ers. So a lot of Hall of Famers on each team. And it's not just Russell's team, okay? It's like every team had Hall of Famers, and the fact that Russell dominated all of them is why he's so great. Okay, next point about not being athletic. Russell and Wilt. So people say that Russell and Wilt would not be athletic today because today's players are so much more, athletic, and with modern medicine and everything and training techniques. Well, the thing is, if they played today, they would be just as good because they have access to modern medicine and training techniques and better shoes. They wouldn't be rolling in their Converses, and they don't have have low top shoes back then. So the thing is, if Russell and Wilt, they were track runners back in the day, so obviously they were very athletic. You can view YouTube footage about how fast and athletic they were on a channel called Wilt Chamberlain Archive. If you search for the channel called Wilt Chamberlain Archive, you can just get a good idea. Look at Russell's and Wilt's footage, and you can see just how fast and how athletic they were. They were pretty athletic, and even by today's times, I think they would dominate. And people saying they wouldn't be able to dominate in today's NBA. They wouldn't be getting as many rebounds. Wilt wouldn't be scoring 50 points a game. Well, actually, in my opinion, they would dominate even more due to league rules these days. No hand checking and stuff. The league actually became less and less physical as the 90s came along because the flagrant foul was introduced in the 90s. Flagrant foul was introduced in the 90s, and because of that, these days players are really easy to foul people, right? They don't want to touch players. That's why Stephen Curry is so dominant. They don't want to touch players, else they get fouled really easily, right? And back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was really physical. And I believe there was one game where Wilt was even facing, I think, what's that guy's name? Clyde Lovelet from the Celtics, and they knocked Wilt's teeth loose. So that wouldn't happen in today's NBA. You can knock someone's teeth out back then, and you wouldn't get any foul back then. But to these days, you can't even touch a player. So I think they would be even more dominant. And I think there was an interview where Wilt even said himself he would average about 70 points a game if he played in today's NBA because they couldn't even touch him, right? And rebounding wise, I want to talk about the numbers. So numbers wise, I wouldn't think it would be 50 points a game because they wouldn't be playing like 40. Would Wilt play like 45, 46 minutes a game? I don't think they would be playing that many minutes, so I don't think they would get 50 points a game, but I think they would get a lot of points still, like 30 points, maybe 40 points. So those are the numbers. About rebounding wise, I think they can get maybe not 23 rebounds a game like Wilt did, or Russell 25 rebounds in the playoffs. Probably not. The pace is slower these days, so it wouldn't be that many rebounds to get. But I don't doubt that they can get 20 rebounds a game because Dennis Rodman, Ben Wallace, Kevin Love for one season, and Andrew Drummond this year actually averaged over 15 rebounds a game, right? And you have like Dennis Rodman averaging like 18, 19 rebounds a game in the 90s, and Andrew Drummond put up like 20 rebounds a game this season. So if they could do that, then why couldn't Wilt and Russell? Right? It's not like it's impossible. If they can do that in today's game, today's pace, then I'm sure that Wilt and Russell could do it. Okay, so that's my topic about that. Next up, so NBA on TNT is the program with where they talk about they have open court. I think that's what it's talked. They have like Charles Barkley, they have like Ernie Johnson, they have Reggie Miller, they have all these Hall of Famers on, Isaiah Thomas. They have all these Hall of Famers on debating about sports topics. And one of them was the NBA's 50 Greatest Players celebration that happened in 1997, and or 1996 or 1997. They want to talk about 20 years on, who are the next 20 people you'd put on that list, because as you know, there's going to be a lot of Hall of Famers since that time that we want to play on that list. So out of the NBA's 50 greatest players, I took a look, and there's some players I want to take off because I don't think they were dominant enough. So first of all, people talked about at least on that show, Shaq talked about taking Bill Walton off the list because he only scored 6,000 points. Well, I'm not going to take Bill Walton off. I'm leaving him on the list because in his prime, he was a top 10 center, won a finals MVP and a ring, all within the span of 2 years. And ESPN also ranked him in the top 50, so I'm not going to take Bill Walton off the list. But however, I am going to take off some other players on the list. I'm going to take off Dave DeBusschere because he was a great defensive player, but career-wise, he's not good enough to be top 50, I think, or top 70, I guess, in this case. We're talking top 70 here, I guess, now, because we're adding 20 players to the list. Dave DeBusschere is not a top 70 player, in my opinion. Pete Maravich, I'm taking off because he really revolutionized the game, but career-wise, accomplishment-wise, I don't think he did that much. So I'm going to take Pete Maravich off, Soy Pistol Pete. Next player I'm going to take off is Earl Monroe. I don't think Earl Monroe deserves to be a top 70 player. He was a great player, no question about that, but only All-NBA first team one time. I just don't think he was dominant enough. Other players, Lenny Wilkens. I realize that Lenny Wilkens is really top 15 or something in assists. Might be top 10, but I'm taking him off too because he was never really that dominant during his career. He was just consistent. So I'm going to take those 4 players off the list. So we have 24 spots that we can put in the list now, okay? That's to make room for some better players, in my opinion. So number 1, obviously Kobe Bryant goes in. Number 1 is Kobe. Number 2, Tim Duncan goes in. Number 3, Dwayne Wade goes in. Number 4, Allen Iverson goes in. These are all, obviously shoo-ins. Number 5, LeBron James goes in. Number 6, Kevin Garnett. Number 7, Dirk Nowitzki. Number 8, Jason Kidd. Number 9, Steve Nash. Number 10, Chris Paul. Number 11, I'm going to put Dwight Howard in the top 70. He's a top 70 player. Dwight Howard. Number 12, Paul Pierce. Number 13, Gary Payton. Number 14, Adrian Dantley, who I think gets the spot over Alex English. I like Dantley better. Number 15, Bob McAdoo. Number 16, Steph Curry. Number 17, Kevin Durant. Number 18, Russell Westbrook. Number 19, I'm going to put Neil Johnston in. Number 20, I'm going to put Tom Heinsohn in. 22, I'm going to put, actually what? So that was 20 was Neil Johnston. 19 was Neil Johnston. 20 was Tom Heinsohn. 21, Dominique Wilkins, right? 22, Carmelo Anthony. 23, Dennis Johnson. 24, Alex English. So I'm going to put those guys in. So those are my top 24 picks, okay? So I have Kobe, Duncan, Wade, Iverson, LeBron, Garnett, Dirk, Kidd, Nash, CP3, Dwight, Pierce, Payton, Dantley, McAdoo, Curry, Durant, Westbrook, English, Johnston, Heinsohn, Dominique, Carmelo, and Dennis Johnson. For my next 24 players I want to include in the NBA's top 70 greatest players. And I'm going to take out Dave DeBusschere, Pete Maravich, Earl Monroe, and Lenny Wilkens. Alright. And I didn't include any ABA guys. If I had to include ABA guys, I would include Artis Gilmore, Mel Daniels, Connie Hawkins, Roger Brown, Dan Issel, George McGinnis, Spencer Haywood. Those will all be in consideration, but these are just for NBA, right? Yeah, we should consider ABA guys though if we do these kind of rankings. But yep, that would be another kind of conversation. Who is the best ABA NBA combined list? Okay, so next topic is the All-NBA players of each decade. So on an episode of Open Court, I saw Ernie Johnson and Shaq and these guys. They debated about which NBA players they would put from each decade, from the 1960s to 2000s. And yeah, so they go through each of these decades and they name their players by position or by who do you think is the best player of each decade. And I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to do a slightly different way. First of all, I'm going to go a little bit further than that. I'm going to name all the NBA players who I think are the best from 1950s all the way to 2010s, that's this decade, plus an NBA second team from the 1960s to 2000s. I'm not going to name a second team for the 1950s or this decade because there just weren't many good players in the 1950s. In 2010s, that means this decade hasn't even finished yet, so that's why. But yeah, that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to make some rules. These are just my top 5 players, regardless of position, for each decade. And so I'm not going by position, and each player can only be named once. So once I name a player, so for example, I can't put Kareem in the 1970s team, and I can't put Kareem in the 1980s team because he's already been named. So I'm just going to put them, each player can only be named once, okay? So here we go, 1950s, 2010s, I'm going to name a first team, and then 1960s to 2000s, I'm going to name a first team and a second team. Okay, so you ready? Here we go, 1950s. I'm going to go with Bob Cousy, Paul Arizin, Dolph Schayes, Bob Pettit, and George Mikan. So that's my 1950s All-NBA team. 1960s first team, going with Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, Bill Russell, and Wilt Chamberlain. Yeah, pretty easy. Second team, I'm going with Willis Reed, Hal Greer, Billy Cunningham, Jerry Lucas, and Nate Thurmond. So that's my 1960s team. Alright, 1970s team, I'm going with Walt Frazier, John Havlicek, Rick Barry, Elvin Hayes, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Second team, I'm going with Tiny Archibald, Wes Unseld, Dave Cowens, George Gervin, and Bill Walton. So that's my 1970s team. I'm not including ABA players in this, by the way, so I would have included Mel Daniels or Artis Gilmore probably. 1980s, I'm going with first team, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Isaiah Thomas, Dr. J, and Moses Malone. Second team, I'm going with Kevin McHale, Dennis Johnson, James Worthy, Bernard King, and Dominique Wilkins. So that's my 1980s team. Okay, 1990s team, here we go. First team, John Stockton, Michael Jordan, Karl Malone, Hakeem Olajuwon, and David Robinson. And with my second team, I'm going with Gary Payton, Clyde Drexler, Scottie Pippen, Patrick Ewing, and Grant Hill. Alright, and 2000s team. Alright, first team, here we go. Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and Shaq. And my second team, I'm going with Steve Nash, Jason Kidd, Dwayne Wade, Paul Pierce, and Dirk Nowitzki. Alright, and here we go to finish it off, the 2010s decade, which hasn't even finished yet, but here's my top 5 picks right now. Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, and Anthony Davis. So if you guys have any questions or comments, if you agree or disagree with some of my picks, then please let me know. But those are my topics I want to talk about today for basketball. But as always, please leave your comments. If you want to flame me or disagree with me, then leave it in the comments. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Peace out.